Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for week 3 of studying the New Testament. So, for today, I would like to help us understand more the world of the New Testament. Let's see the landscape of what was happening in the world when the stories of Jesus took place. So, to understand the New Testament, we need to first understand what happened between the Old and the New Testament. Because if you finish reading the Old Testament, and then you get to the New Testament, you're going to notice there's a lot of differences. Think of the things that are mentioned in the New Testament that really are not mentioned much at all in the Old Testament. Baptism, for example. Baptism is very central in the New Testament, not mentioned much at all in the Old Testament. Crucifixion, that was not a practice at all in the Old Testament, but obviously we know it is very much a part of the New Testament story. The devil. You really don't hear much about the devil in the Old Testament, and you do a ton in the New Testament. And other words and phrases like Gentile, Pharisee, Rabbi, Roman, these were foreign to the Old Testament, but have taken prominence in the New Testament. Why? Well, let's understand what happened between when the Old Testament left off and when we received the New Testament. So, the end of the Old Testament. The nation of Israel reached its high point under King David 1,000 years before Jesus. So, 1,000 years before Jesus was born, King David and the monarchy of Israel was really having its heyday. It went slowly downhill after that with King Solomon, and eventually the kingdom being divided in two after that, all the way to the point of 587 BC. So that's going to be a crucial date for us. That is when Jerusalem was conquered by the Babylonians. So remember, Jerusalem is where the temple was housed. It was the main place of worship in the Old Testament. But in 587, the temple is destroyed, and there is what is referred to as the diaspora. That is Greek for dispersion. And so what that means is many of the Jewish people living in Jerusalem, they were dispersed to all the surrounding countries and areas. Many of them went into exile at that time. So the question emerged during this time period, during the diaspora, how do you worship without a temple? I mean, temple was absolutely central to how they understood worship of God with the whole sacrificial system, with bringing of animals. I mean, that's the whole book of Leviticus, right? So what do you do now if the temple doesn't exist? How do you worship God faithfully? So there became an emphasis on the Torah. The Torah are the first 5 books of the Bible. The emphasis was on following these commands that we find in the Torah, and that became how you really were seen as a faithful Jew. And local synagogues really emerged as the main place of worship. So rather than traveling to Jerusalem to worship in a temple, since the temple did not exist and you were spread out everywhere, Jews would create local synagogues, and that became the main place of worship. So here's what happened after this. You really have 4 then main time periods between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. So remember, 537, that's when the temple was destroyed, and that really started the Persian period of time. So you can see for about 200 years, the Jewish people were living under oppression of a different government, the Persian government. Now, we will note that about 50 years after the temple was destroyed, King Cyrus allowed some Jews to return and build a new temple, but it was a much smaller temple, and it was not many people were living around there or traveling back to there. It wasn't the same place of worship like it was before. But you can read about this second temple in the books or the stories of Ezra, the book of Nehemiah. These are the stories of the creation of this next temple in the Persian period. But for most of this period, all the Jewish people were still spread out in the region. And then when the Persians were defeated, They were defeated by Alexander the Great. So this ushered in the Hellenistic period or the Greek period. You can see from 332 to 167 BC. Not a whole lot changed for the Jewish people in this period, but then in the Hasmonean period, 167 to 63 BC, for about 100 years, that's when something major happened. There was what's called the Maccabean Revolt. You had a group of people, the Maccabees, Jewish people, who said, we're tired of living under oppression. I mean, we have lived under oppression from the Persians to the Greeks to now the Hasmoneans. And so we want to become our own independent Jewish state again, just like we were under King David. So they revolted. And for a while, it worked. That the festival of Hanukkah, it remembers this time period. This is when this emerged, this festival, and it remembers the Jewish independence during the Maccabean revolt. Now, it did not last, and eventually that independent Jewish state was once again taken over, and that brings us to the Roman period. So the Roman period is the time period when Jesus is born. The Romans conquered from starting around 63 BC, and we go through 70. Now, they conquered longer than that, but we're ending at 70 AD because that's when the Second Temple was destroyed. That's when another group of Jews decided, no, we want to rebel against Rome, but it did not work. And Rome came down hard on the Jewish state and destroyed that Second Temple in Jerusalem as well. But what I want us to point out is that Jesus, he lived during this Roman period after hundreds of years of Jews living under oppressive rulers. So he was born around 0 to 33 AD. So let's learn a little bit more about that. So I'm going to move my picture up so you can see what we have here. So during the time of Jesus, there were several Jewish sects in the New Testament. You're going to recognize a lot of these. There were Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes are the first three that we want to study. In your reading this week, I bet you'll see there's quite a bit of disputes between Jesus and the Pharisees. They were one of the larger groups of Jewish people living under Roman oppression during Jesus' day. Now, they emphasized faithfulness to the Torah. That is how they continued the belief that that is how you are a faithful Jew, by living under the commands of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. They were mainly outside of Jerusalem. So Pharisees were not centralized in Jerusalem. They were mainly in the countryside and those surrounding cities. They believed that all people had to follow the law. This was of utmost importance for understanding faithfulness, which is why they get into so many disputes with Jesus about what the law really means and what it means to follow the law, because to them, the law was of the utmost importance. And then they were most often the leaders of the local synagogues. So remember, synagogues were almost what we call our churches today, created when that first temple was destroyed. They provided the leadership of the synagogues. And then you have Sadducees. Now, Sadducees were not the largest group, that was Pharisees, but they were the most powerful group. They wielded the most power in Jewish circles. They were centered in Jerusalem. And they really ran the Sanhedrin, which was like the Jewish Supreme Court. So they held a lot of power. And they controlled really the whole temple system with an emphasis on the sacrificial system in Jerusalem. So they did not emphasize so much following the laws to be faithful. To them, faithfulness meant the sacrifices. Now, the Essenes are a really interesting one. So we don't hear of them directly in the New Testament, but they lived during this time period. They were ascetic separatists, which means that they really lived in their own communities that were far outside any cities or towns, just kind of doing their own thing. They wanted to live apart from the majority of other people. But what's fascinating is that We believe they were the ones who preserved the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls, this was back in, I think, 1947, somewhere around there. There was a shepherd in Palestine, and he was looking for a lost goat. He was a young boy, and he threw a rock in a cave, and he heard something shatter. So he went into the cave, and he discovered that there were all these clay pots, and within them, there were these scrolls. Well, over the next 10 or 11 years, people excavated about 11 caves right around there, and they discovered, I think it was about 900 scrolls and writings. Most of those were biblical. For example, they had the entire scroll of Isaiah hidden in one of those caves. And it was 1,000 years earlier than any other writing of Isaiah that we had. And what was incredible was that word for word, it lined up with the 1,000 year later document that we had. So it shows you how carefully these sacred texts were preserved over the years. So we have the Essenes during this time period as well. Let's see who else we have to talk about. We have the Zealots. The Zealots were anti-Roman Jews. They wanted to overthrow the Roman government. You may have heard of the Sicarii. These were knife-wielding assassins who, if they believed you were partnering in any way with the Roman state, they would stab you and assassinate you. And they were responsible for the uprising against Rome around AD 70 when that second temple then was destroyed by Rome. But interesting enough, one of Jesus' disciples is called Simon the Zealot. And so it seems like one of Jesus' own disciples had this sort of philosophy and mentality. Then you have the Samaritans. Now, you've heard Samaritans before, but I think it's fascinating to understand the history of them. They lived mostly in Samaria, which was between Judea, where Jerusalem was, and Galilee, where Jesus spent the majority of his ministry. And so if Jesus was going to travel from Galilee to Judea, he would most often travel through Samaria. Samaria, the Samaritans themselves, they claimed that they were descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. So really briefly, at one point in history, there's just one Israel with 12 tribes, and then the northern 10 tribes were taken over and they were taken to other countries. The Samaritans believed that they were descendants of those 10 tribes who eventually made their way back to that area of Samaria. The people descended from the southern two tribes, which would be modern day in this time period Jews. They said, no, 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 you're not descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. You're descendants of the people who colonized that area after the Jews left. So they said, you're just kind of foreign colonists. You are someone that we disagree with on our history and belief system. And so they really, Jews and Samaritans, didn't trust each other. They truly hated each other during this time period. And then there were Gentiles. Now, Gentiles were basically everybody else. Everyone who was not a Jewish person, Romans, Greeks, Persians, anybody outside of these Jewish circles. So I'd love to now take us through a little bit more of the differences between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, because you're going to see them probably most often in your readings of the New Testament. Pharisees were primarily middle class. Sadducees, mostly upper class. Pharisees, as we talked about, they were mostly outside of Jerusalem. Sadducees, mostly inside Jerusalem. So, to a Pharisee, you were a faithful Jew if you had obedience through the law, all the rules and commandments. For Sadducees, you were faithful by obedience through the temple, the sacrificial system. Now, this is really fascinating. Pharisees accepted the whole Old Testament as we have today. They believed those were authoritative books. The Sadducees did not. They accepted only the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. Pharisees believed in resurrection, the possibility of life after death, and Sadducees did not. They did not think there was any possibility of resurrection. To that extent, Pharisees recognized the existence of celestial beings, so they believed in angels and demons. Sadducees did not. They did not believe in the existence of angels or demons. Pharisees became really the primary forebearers of modern Judaism, what we have today. Sadducees disappeared after the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. We don't see them again in history after that, which makes sense because if they believed worship centered around the temple, then if you don't have the temple, how do you worship? So this is just a little bit of a glimpse of what the new landscape of the New Testament looks like. I hope this enriches your reading as you go through your readings of the New Testament and you see some of these people and terms pop up and you'll know a little bit more about them. We will see you next week.